Hey guys, tonight we walk into the oldest known cities on Earth, where moonlight falls over mud brick walls, oil lamps tremble in the dark, and little wedges pressed into wet clay begin to whisper about problems that may feel uncomfortably familiar. Some of what you'll hear is widely accepted history, grounded in archaeology, museum shelves, and the patient work of translators. Some of it is interpretation, because old words rarely sit still for long. And some of it is calm, what-if imagination, the kind that lets a dusty tablet breathe a little in the midnight air, without pretending it has solved every mystery. Historians debate plenty here, and they should, because 5,000 years can blur even the sharpest reed stylus mark. You probably would not survive this world very well, mostly because your sleep schedule, your soft shoes and your dependence on indoor plumbing would last about 10 minutes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in imagination, at least standing at the edge of southern Mesopotamia, where the land lies broad and flat between the Tigris and Euphrates, and the night holds the scent of damp earth, silt smoke, and river reeds. This is the world of Sumer, a place most historians agree gave us some of the earliest cities and some of the earliest writing. Long before marble empires and polished highways, before paperbacks and password resets, people here were already trying to pin the chaos of life down with marks in clay. What's broadly accepted is simple enough. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, in places such as Uruk, administrators began using tokens, seals, and then written signs to track goods, labour and obligations. Archaeology suggests that writing did not begin as poetry floating down from the heavens. It began rather wonderfully as paperwork, which is both deeply humbling and a little funny. Humanity reaches one of its greatest inventions and almost immediately uses it for inventory. Somewhere the first clerk is already tired. You step closer to a workshop lit by a low flame. A scribe sits cross-legged with a lump of moist clay and a cut reed stylus. He presses wedges into the surface with small practiced movements. The sound is faint, a dry little tick-tick-tick, like a patient beetle knocking on wood. The tablet is not trying to dazzle you. It does not announce itself as a prophecy machine. It lists counts records: barley, oil, wool, rations, names, deliveries, days of work. The evidence we do have points to a world where information matters because survival depends on it. And yet, as you lean into the dark, one interpretation is that these early records feel modern precisely because they are so ordinary. They do not mainly show you gods throwing lightning bolts. They show you systems, people managing shortages, institutions measuring effort, cities trying to stay coherent while thousands of lives bump against one another. What if the oldest whisper from civilization is not grandeur at all, but administration with a headache? That might sound less dramatic than buried treasure, but honestly, it is more intimate. A king's statue can impress you from a distance. A ration tablet gets uncomfortably close. It says somebody had to show up. Somebody counted the grain. Somebody worried there might not be enough next month. Somebody probably blamed the wrong co-worker. You can almost hear the ancient version of "I sent that shipment 3 days ago." Most historians agree that many Sumerian tablets are practical records. But there are also literary texts, royal inscriptions, hymns, myths, proverbs, and laments that survive from Sumerian tradition, some preserved in later copies from Mesopotamian scribal schools. That matters because it means the clay does more than count. It remembers how people thought, feared, boasted, prayed, and imagined. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But where the record is clearer, it shows something almost eerie in its familiarity. Human beings living together at scale create repeating problems: crowding, hierarchy, reputation, debt, flooding, uncertainty. The names change. The feeling often does not. You picture the city at dawn, now not silent, but humming. Donkeys snort in narrow lanes. Bakers work near warm ovens. Water sloshes in jars. Temple staff move in organised lines. Children stir. Somewhere a foreman is already disappointed, which does seem to be one of civilization's oldest hobbies. Uruk and other Sumerian cities were not sleepy villages with a charming handmade soap aesthetic. They were dense, ambitious and demanding. Archaeology suggests large temple complexes, storerooms, workshops and administrative buildings tied daily life to institutions much larger than any one household. A careful reading might suggest that this is the first heartbeat of a very old modernity. Not modern in technology, of course. You are not about to find Wi-Fi hidden in a mud brick wall. Though a fringe idea proposes all kinds of dramatic things once the internet gets bored after midnight. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you will sometimes hear popular rumours claiming the Sumerians secretly knew everything from advanced electricity to space travel. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. What we can say more carefully is that Sumerian records reveal a society already wrestling with scale. How do you feed a city? How do you track labour? How do you legitimise power? How do you respond when rivers behave badly, which they often do? How do you make sense of suffering when disease, drought or conflict arrives without asking permission first? A careful reading might suggest that the most startling thing about these texts is not that they predict our exact moment, but that they describe patterns we still inhabit. Historians still argue whether some later copies preserve truly ancient memories in reliable form, or whether scribes reshaped older material for new audiences. That debate matters. It reminds you not to lean too hard on certainty just because the atmosphere feels dramatic. Let me rephrase that more carefully. These tablets do not hand you a neat secret message saying, "Hello, future person. Yes, this is about your traffic jam, your tax forms and your existential dread." That's a possibility, not a certainty. What they do offer is something quieter and in a sleepy way more profound. They reveal that many features of human life were already in motion when writing itself was young. You run your fingers gently in imagination along the edge of a drying tablet. The clay is cool. The marks are crisp. Someone made these signs with no idea that people thousands of years later would squint at them under museum glass and feel a strange little jolt of recognition. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Still, even the documented parts are enough to unsettle you in the most soothing way possible. Civilization did not begin with clean lines and stable wisdom. It began messy, account books, anxious rulers, labour rosters, myths, arguments, river mud, and people trying to make tomorrow manageable. And that perhaps is why the old clay feels alive tonight. Not because it proves anything mystical, not because it confirms a hidden code, but because it preserves the smallest pulse of a truth that may still matter now. You build a city, and the city begins building worries of its own. You invent writing, and writing immediately starts keeping score. You gather people together for safety, trade, ritual, and glory, and in the process you also create noise-pressure comparison, and the eternal mystery of why the grain delivery is late again. Some inventions never really age. So you keep walking deeper into the lamplit dark, while the river breathes somewhere beyond the walls, and the first wedge marks of history wait in your hand like tiny footprints. If the oldest records still feel current, perhaps that is not because the tablets are magical. Perhaps it is because people have always been people, and clay, unlike memory, is annoyingly good at saving receipts. The clay stays with you as you move farther into the night, its cool weight lingering in your palm like a small stubborn fact, and the city around you begins to wake more fully, not with a dramatic trumpet blast, but with the layered hum of ordinary life. That hum is one of the oldest sounds civilization makes. It is sandals on packed earth jars bumping against hips, reed baskets brushing door frames, donkeys objecting to employment in the only language donkeys have ever trusted. And somewhere above it all, the first pale light catching the upper edges of mud brick walls. Most historians agree that places like Uruk grew to a scale unlike earlier villages, becoming among the first true cities in human history. Archaeology suggests dense neighbourhoods, large institutions, busy workshops, and a level of organised urban life that would have felt startlingly new to the people inside it. And new as humanity keeps learning rarely means peaceful. You walk through a lane narrow enough that two loaded men cannot pass without one turning sideways and muttering something impolite beneath his breath. The air is thick with oven heat dung smoke, damp clay and the sweet edge of fermenting grain. The city is productive, impressive, and just a little exhausting. A careful reading might suggest that some Sumerian records and later Mesopotamian writings capture this exact tension. Cities promise abundance, but they also multiply friction. The crowd becomes a kind of weather. It presses, it jostles, it keeps you from pretending you are the centre of the world, which is frankly rude. What's broadly accepted is that Uruk and related urban centres depended on complex systems of food storage, labour coordination, and institutional oversight. You are not looking at a loose collection of cottages around a cheerful pond. You are inside a machine made of people grain, canals, walls, and ritual. The temple precinct looms ahead, massive and ordered drawing in goods and labour, like a great mud brick lung. Workers come and go, carrying baskets, tools, clay jars, bundles of reeds, and small tablets still damp from inscription. Somewhere, someone is counting sheep. Somewhere else, someone is very sure that the sheep were counted wrong. One interpretation is that this feels uncomfortably close to modern urban life, because cities, once they reach a certain scale, begin producing the same emotional furniture over and over. Noise, delay, crowding, status anxiety, opportunity mixed with irritation. You might not find a Sumerian tablet saying the commute is ruining my spirit. Not in those words anyway. But you do find evidence of systems straining to hold a lot of people together. And if you have ever waited in a line that moves with the urgency of an elderly turtle on a tea break, you already understand the mood. You pause beside a market edge where barley sacks sit in rough stacks and pottery catches the morning light. This is not quite a modern market in the sense of independent boutiques and little chalkboard signs offering artisanal dates. Much of Sumerian economic life appears tied to households' institutions and redistributive systems rather than a fully open market economy as people imagine it today. Still goods move, people bargain, information circulates, news travels by voice, glance, rumour and memory. A popular rumour claims every age is uniquely chaotic, but the evidence we do have points to a more humbling possibility. Urban chaos may be one of the most ancient shared human experiences. Historians still argue whether the earliest cities should be understood mainly as engines of cooperation or as systems of extraction that asked ordinary people to carry more than they received. That debate is worth holding gently in your mind as you move through the crowd. The city feeds many mouths and creates opportunities that scattered village life cannot match, but it also concentrates power, obligation, and surveillance. A careful reading might suggest that once writing labour administration and hierarchy locked together, life becomes more predictable in some ways and more pressurised in others. You gain security, you lose a certain kind of breathing room. The streets themselves tell part of the story. They twist and narrow, not because urban planners forgot to consult a software model, but because cities often grow like roots, adapting layering, thickening over time. Mud brick houses lean close, roof lines create strips of shade, children chase one another around jars and doorways, A dog sleeps exactly where everybody needs to step, which does lend the whole scene an eternal quality. Archaeology suggests domestic spaces were compact and practical, often clustered tightly in ways that made privacy limited and neighbourhood life intense. That may not sound glamorous, but it does sound familiar in the deepest way. Civilization invites you closer together than your patience can comfortably tolerate. And then there is the noise. You notice it not as one sound, but as 1,000 small claims on attention. Hammering, braying, reed mats dragged across floors, grain poured into containers, someone arguing over a measure, someone chanting, someone laughing too loudly for this hour. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not prophecy exactly, but recognition. If the earliest great cities already sounded like this, then perhaps one of the most modern feelings of all, the sense that the world is too crowded and too loud and somehow still impossible to ignore, is not modern at all. Most historians agree that urbanization transformed human relationships in Mesopotamia. It changed work, religion, administration, and the way strangers encountered one another. In a village, everyone may know your mother, your goat, and the embarrassing thing you did near the well when you were 9. In a city, anonymity begins to flicker into existence. Not complete anonymity, of course. Institutions still know your labour, your obligations, your place. But the crowd introduces a strange possibility. You can disappear slightly even while being surrounded. One interpretation is that this is the beginning of a very old loneliness, though we will save that fuller mood for later. For now, it is enough to say that the city makes you visible to systems and less visible to souls, which is a trade human beings keep making with mixed reviews. A fringe idea proposes that Sumerian cities encoded advanced knowledge about our own age in symbolic form, and now and then people point to maps, stars or grand alignments and declare the whole urban world a secret warning about the present. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because cities themselves feel uncanny. They gather so much human intention in one place that they almost seem alive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, there is still a gentler insight available. Ancient people may not have predicted skyscrapers and traffic lights, but they did understand the emotional physics of density. Put enough people together and wonder and stress begin sharing a wall. By midday at least, in imagination, heat starts pressing down over the roofs. The streets smell sharper now, dust clings to damp skin. The temple complex rises ahead not merely as a religious centre, but as a sign that urban life in Sumer is inseparable from organised authority. Archaeology suggests institutions, coordinated labour storage, and offerings on a substantial scale. What's broadly accepted is that these places were not only sacred, but administrative. Prayer and paperwork were neighbours. Honestly, humanity has always loved a multi-purpose building. You notice a young scribe stepping carefully through the lane with a newly inscribed tablet. He holds it with the seriousness of someone carrying a fragile and slightly annoying truth. Maybe it records barley allocations, maybe labour assignments, maybe a delivery dispute already old by the time the clay was pressed. A more cautious explanation could be that most tablets are narrower in meaning than our imaginations want them to be. But even when they are plain, they remain powerful. The city becomes real to itself through records. The crowd becomes legible. Once that happens, life changes. People are no longer only remembered, they are listed. And that may be the first city's quiet trick. It turns human movement into a pattern, then tries to manage the pattern before it slips away. You can feel it all around you now, in the pressed shoulders of the crowd, in the measured grain, in the lanes too narrow for comfort, in the constant adjustments required to share space with so many beating hearts. The hum is relentless, almost soothing if you stop resisting it, like a fan in a hot room or rain on a roof. 5,000 years fall away for a moment. The evidence we do have points to this simple and slightly inconvenient truth. The first great cities may already have known what it feels like to be overwhelmed by the very systems that keep you alive. And as you walk on through Uruk's breathing maze of mud brick and murmurs, you begin to suspect that the old clay records are not eerie because they foretell your world in detail. They are eerie because they describe the first drafts of problems you still live inside now, only with fewer reeds, and somehow even more paperwork. The city's hum follows you even as the lane widens, and the air changes, becoming less domestic and more ceremonial, touched now by incense-trampled reeds, warm plaster, and the faint metallic scent of worked tools and polished ornaments. Ahead, a courtyard opens in stages through gateways and walls, and here the whole machinery of authority begins to show its face. Not its true face, perhaps. Power is rarely that generous, but at least its chosen face, the one it once remembered. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian rulers used inscriptions, monuments, offerings, and public building projects to establish legitimacy. Most historians agree that kingship in ancient Mesopotamia was never just a matter of force. It also had to be narrated, and narrated well. You can almost admire the ambition of it. Humanity invents writing, and before long, somebody realizes it can preserve not only grain accounts, but also reputation. Somewhere in the distance, a ruler who has never heard the phrase public relations is already doing an excellent impression of it. A king's inscription may announce his piety, his victories, his temple restorations, his justice, his closeness to the gods, his ability to keep order from fraying at the edges. It is not quite an election poster, it is more sacred than that, more formal, more dangerous if challenged. Still, one interpretation is that these records resemble an early form of political messaging in which authority is strengthened not merely by action but by carefully arranged memory. You move through the courtyard as workers pass with baskets and jars, while scribes and attendants cluster near shaded walls. Somewhere nearby a priest recites words that drift in and out of hearing. Somewhere else a mason smooths a surface that may soon receive a dedicatory text. In this world, power does not float invisibly above daily life. It is baked into bricks, carried in processions, inscribed into clay, and repeated aloud until it acquires the texture of inevitability. The evidence we do have points to rulers presenting themselves as chosen, capable, and indispensable, which, in fairness, is exactly what rulers in almost every era would like you to think. A careful reading might suggest that the truly modern thing here is not just propaganda itself, but the emotional strategy underneath it. A leader does not simply claim strength. He claims order in a disorderly world. He claims provision in an anxious economy. He claims divine favour when the river might flood too much or not enough. He claims continuity when fear is lurking just off stage. If you listen closely, the boast is never only a boast. It is also a sedative. That sounds a little cynical, so let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient kings were not necessarily inventing fake realities from nothing. Many really did sponsor construction, wage war, redistribute resources, and maintain institutions. The buildings existed, the offerings happened, the labour was organised. But one interpretation is that inscriptions turned those actions into narrative theatre, shaping how subjects understood the king's place in the universe. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that even very early states understood something essential. People do not live by bread and barley alone. They live by stories about who is keeping chaos away. And chaos, as usual, is never far off. You stand now before a carved or inscribed dedication, or perhaps imagine one through the fragments scholars have pieced together. The ruler speaks in the first person. He built, he restored, he honoured the gods, he defeated enemies, he secured the land. It all sounds steady and confident, and that is partly the point. The words do not normally preserve the moment of doubt before dawn, the failed harvest calculation, the tense conversation with temple officials, or the fact that someone somewhere almost certainly thought, this man again. Power prefers a clean script. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian kingship should be seen mainly as a religious office with political functions or as political domination wrapped in sacred language. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But what is clear enough is that rulers and institutions worked hard to connect authority with cosmic order. A king was not merely strong, he was presented as proper, legitimate, necessary. In a world vulnerable to flood, famine, conflict, and social strain, that message would have landed with real force. You picture torchlight flickering across plastered walls at night, and suddenly the whole setting feels cinematic in a very old way. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if these inscriptions are not only declarations of power, but mirrors of public anxiety? A ruler insists he has stabilized the city because the city is not stable by default. He praises himself as protector because people already know protection can fail. He boasts of rebuilding temples because temples, like confidence, need maintenance. The message only works if the fear beneath it is already familiar. Most historians agree that rulers in Sumer and later Mesopotamia linked themselves closely to divine favour, though not always in exactly the same way across periods and cities. Some were described as specially chosen beloved of a deity or entrusted with sacred responsibilities. A fringe idea proposes that these claims conceal literal contact with otherworldly beings who handed down kingship from the stars. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because the language of divine selection sounds dramatic to modern ears. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, something more useful appears. Even without turning gods into astronauts, you can see how sacred language magnifies political authority. The ruler becomes more than a man. He becomes a hinge between order above and order below. There is a sleepy little joke hiding in that too. The oldest cities may already have discovered that if you want people to accept a difficult system, it helps to tell them the system is cosmically endorsed. It is a strategy with a long career. Dress hierarchy in bigger language, and it starts sounding less like hierarchy and more like destiny, very convenient, almost suspiciously convenient. The temple glows. The officials nod. The workers carry on. And somewhere the inscription hardens in clay, preserving the approved version of events for anyone who can read it and for many who cannot. Yet the presence of writing changes the stakes in another way. Once power is written down, it can outlast the voice that spoke it. It can travel, it can be copied, it can be taught. Archaeology suggests scribal education and textual transmission helped preserve administrative and literary traditions over long stretches of time. That means authority in Sumer was not only performed live, it was archived. One interpretation is that this is one of the first moments when politics becomes something like a durable media environment. Not mass media, of course. No one is refreshing a royal feed every 10 seconds. But still, words now extend rule beyond the courtyard. And with that extension comes a puzzle that feels almost current. If a record praises the king, how much does it reveal? And how much does it conceal? A more cautious explanation could be that royal inscriptions are both valuable sources and carefully shaped presentations. They tell you what a ruler wanted remembered, which is not the same as what everybody else experienced. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Behind each triumphant line may stand overworked labourers, tense negotiations, rival elites, uneasy farmers and ordinary people whose names survive only if they were counted for someone else's purpose. Still, you should not flatten the whole scene into simple cynicism. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Kingship in Sumer was real consequential and tied to institutions that genuinely organised life. Temples were built, canals were maintained, walls were raised, rituals were observed. Cities did not run on slogans alone, yet the slogans mattered. They helped turn force into order and order into belief. So you linger a little longer in the courtyard watching the early light warm the brick, and the carved words hold their steady pose. The king speaks from clay as though certainty itself could be moulded and dried in the sun. But beneath the confidence, you can feel the softer truth pressing through. Authority has to keep explaining itself because people are never fully persuaded for free. The first cities knew that already. And if those old inscriptions sound familiar now, perhaps it's because every age has leaders who promise to steady the world, and every age has listeners trying to decide whether the promise is shelter theatre or some uneasy blend of both. From the courtyard of kingship and carved certainty, you drift back towards softer ground, toward the damp edges of the world that no ruler ever fully controls. The city can count, grain assign labour dedicate temples, and praise itself in polished lines, but the rivers still do as rivers please. They swell, wander, spill, retreat, leave behind fertile mud and broken plans, and remind everybody that civilization in southern Mesopotamia is built not on solid stone, but on negotiation with water. Most historians agree that flood stories echo through Mesopotamian tradition in many forms, and archaeology suggests that life in this landscape was shaped by both the gifts and the dangers of river systems. One interpretation is that the old flood narratives feel current because every age imagines in its own accent that the waters are rising again. You can smell the river before you see it. Silt reeds wet clay fish, and the faint rot of stagnant channels where the flow has slowed. Night has thinned now into a silver-grey dawn, and mist lies low across the banks. Men with poles move small boats through side channels. Labourers check embankments and irrigation routes. Somewhere a child squats at the edge of a muddy patch poking at snails, with the serious concentration children always bring to activities adults find vaguely alarming. The whole scene is practical, ordinary, and somehow full of tension. Water is life here. Water is danger here. Water is inconveniently both at once. What's broadly accepted is that the peoples of ancient Mesopotamia depended on careful water management. Canals, levees, ditches, and organised labour made agriculture possible on a large scale. Archaeology suggests irrigation was not a luxury or a side project. It was the nervous system of settled life. But river valleys are generous in the same way cats are affectionate. They may offer nourishment and then without much notice rearrange your world. Floods could enrich fields with fresh silt or damage homes, wash out boundaries, overwhelm storage areas and turn roads into sticky arguments with the earth. A careful reading might suggest that this is one reason flood stories endure so powerfully in Mesopotamian literature. They are not merely fantasy spectacles dropped into myth for dramatic flair. A more cautious explanation could be that they preserve cultural memory of living with unstable water over long stretches of time, when stories speak of overwhelming floods sent by divine will. They may reflect both religious imagination and real environmental experience. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it helps keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk along a raised path near the river's edge, where reeds whisper in the breeze and the mud gives slightly beneath your feet. In the distance, the city rises as a band of walls and rooftops against the brightening sky, and you begin to understand how fragile that confidence really is. One hard season, one badly timed inundation, one damaged canal system, and all the administrative brilliance in the world starts looking a lot less invincible. The evidence we do have points to a society that understood vulnerability very well. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts often frame order as something won against threat, not something guaranteed by default. Historians still argue whether particular flood traditions preserve memory of a single major event, a series of regional disasters blended over time, or a broader symbolic pattern rooted in long familiarity with dangerous waters. There is no full consensus, and honestly, that is part of what keeps the subject quietly compelling. Human beings love to pin one big story onto a messy pattern, but landscapes usually resist that kind of neatness. Rivers do not read your outline. They improvise. And yet the flood story keeps returning. In later Mesopotamian literature, especially in traditions surrounding Atrahasis and the flood, narrative known from the Epic of Gilgamesh. A great deluge becomes a stage on which divine displeasure, human survival, and the fragility of civilization all meet. Most historians agree these texts belong to later literary traditions rather than being simple transcripts from early Sumer itself, but they grow from the same broad cultural world. One interpretation is that such stories remain powerful because they dramatize a fear every settled society knows. Not just death, but erasure. Not merely hardship, but the terrifying idea that everything carefully built could be washed clean away. That fear may sound modern, because it still is. Storms surge, broken levees, swollen coastlines, sudden weather maps glowing with colours no one wants to see. You do not need to force prophecy into the tablet to feel the connection. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if flood myths endure because human beings keep discovering over and over that nature does not care how organised their filing system is? A fringe idea proposes that Mesopotamian flood accounts preserve literal knowledge of a planet-wide catastrophe that resets civilization in repeated cycles, and you will hear this idea told with great confidence by people who have never met a nuance they did not immediately misplace. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because flood myths feel enormous. They invite grand explanations. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, a gentler and more grounded mystery appears. The real puzzle may be how environmental danger becomes memory, memory becomes story, and story becomes something close to universal. You kneel in imagination at least and touch the mud beside the path. It is cool and slick, leaving a film on your fingers. Clay again. Always clay. The same substance that records grain deliveries also carries flood memory, because this world stores both administration and fear in the earth itself. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Still, even the documented parts show that the line between everyday life and disaster was thin. A canal blocked here, an embankment weakened there, a season of unusual rain upriver, and the entire mood of a region could change. There is a sleepy kind of irony in that. Humanity spends centuries building systems to control nature, then spends additional centuries discovering that nature did not sign the agreement. You can almost hear an ancient overseer squinting at a damaged levee with the same tired expression a modern official wears in front of a very unfortunate chart. Civilization once again has receipts but no umbrella. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion placed strong emphasis on the unpredictability of divine and natural forces. In that setting, floods were never just physical events. They could be interpreted as signs of disorder in the cosmic relationship between gods, rulers, and people. A careful reading might suggest that this gave environmental stress a moral dimension. When waters rose or fields failed, communities searched not only for causes, but for meaning. One interpretation is that this remains deeply familiar. Modern people may use different language, more data, and fewer offerings, perhaps, but they still ask the same aching question when disaster hits. Why now? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot cleanly separate practical adaptation from sacred interpretation in the minds of ancient people, because they likely did not divide the world that way themselves. The river was hydrology, yes, but also power mood, divine presence, and risk. The flood was weather, but also warning, memory, and narrative. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not every story about water is secretly a coded forecast of our present, but these old records and traditions do preserve something startlingly durable, the emotional shape of living near forces larger than yourself. The mist begins to lift now, and the river shows its full slow surface brown and reflective under the growing light. Boats move, reeds bend. Behind you the city continues its patient hum, pretending competence in the way cities always do. Ahead of you, water glides past with all the calm indifference in the world, and for a moment the distance between then and now feels very small indeed. Not because a tablet predicted your century with magical precision, but because 5,000 years ago people already knew what it meant to build their lives beside something that nourished them, frightened them, and could never be fully controlled. The river stays behind you, though not entirely, because in Sumer nothing involving water ever really leaves the room. It runs through the fields, through the canals, through the grain, accounts, through the anxieties of officials and workers and households alike. By the time you return towards the inner life of the city, the light has strengthened, and the places that looked silver and mysterious before now show their practical faces. Courtyards are busier, storehouses are open, baskets of barley move from one set of hands to another with the solemn importance of things that stand between order and complaint. Most historians agree that many surviving Mesopotamian tablets deal with grain, labour rations and obligations. Archaeology suggests that barley, in particular, was more than food. It was a unit of value, a wage, a measure of stability, and occasionally the reason someone's morning was ruined. You pause near a storage area where scribes sit with clay and reed styluses, while labourers carry sacks across packed ground. Dust rises in pale little breaths. The smell is dry, nutty and faintly sour, with a background of sweat, sun-warmed mud brick and reed matting. A tablet is being pressed line by line, quantities received, quantities issued, names attached to work or allotment. It looks dull only if you have never worried about bills. One interpretation is that these records feel oddly modern because they revolve around a timeless pressure. Do you have enough? Do you owe more than you can comfortably manage? Will next month be tighter? Has somebody above you decided to call this temporary adjustment, which is a phrase human beings have apparently always used when they want bad news to sound polite? What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian institutions tracked resources with remarkable care. Temple and palace households, in different times and places, coordinated production, storage and redistribution on substantial scales. The evidence we do have points to a society where everyday survival was deeply entangled with accounting. Writing itself, as you have already seen, grows from this need to countersign, verify and remember. Civilization begins by asking, in effect, who owes what to whom? Not exactly a romantic opening, but undeniably effective. You watch a worker receive a ration and step aside. Expression unreadable. Maybe the allotment is fair. Maybe it is barely enough. Maybe it has been reduced because of weather labour demand or some official's decision scribbled into clay with a confidence the hungry rarely find charming. A careful reading might suggest that ancient economic life was not a smooth exchange of cheerful goods in a sunlit market, but a pressured balancing act, shaped by institutions, harvests, seasons, labour obligations and social rank. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case, but it fits the broader evidence well. And that perhaps is where the tablet begins to sound eerily present. Not because it literally predicts credit card debt or online banking, but because it records a life where subsistence and bureaucracy already lean on each other with exhausting intimacy. Most historians agree that many people in ancient Mesopotamia lived close to the edge of what their environment and institutions could support. Grain surpluses mattered, shortfalls mattered more. A more cautious explanation could be that the emotional atmosphere around debt and scarcity was not identical to ours because their systems were different, their values were different, and the social world was arranged in ways that do not map neatly onto modern life. Steel pressure has a recognisable accent. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian temple economies should be imagined as centrally dominant systems controlling most of life, or as important institutions operating alongside households, local exchange, and more flexible arrangements. There's no full consensus, and you should keep that uncertainty tucked gently into your pocket as you move through the storeroom shade. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but the broad picture remains clear enough. Grain labour and obligation were not abstract matters. They structured time hierarchy and daily worry. The tablet in the scribe's hand hardens slowly in the warm air, and you realise that debt in this world is not just an idea. It becomes a mark, a record, a pressure made visible. One interpretation is that once an obligation is written down, it gains a certain chilly authority. Memory can be argued with. Clay is less flexible. If you owe barley labour or service, the wedge marks sit there with the patience of fate. Not actual fate, perhaps, but close enough to make lunch taste less cheerful. There is a light joke lurking here, and you may as well take it, because Sumerian accounting deserves one. Humanity spends ages composing myths about cosmic order, and then much of daily life still comes down to whether somebody updated the ledger correctly. Somewhere, an ancient clerk is insisting the numbers are right, while three equally tired people stare at him with the eternal look of, "That seems unlikely." A fringe idea proposes that hidden inside some administrative and economic tablets are secret warnings about cyclical collapse in human civilization. And every so often, someone will point to an ancient grain shortage as evidence that the end times have been itemized in cuneiform. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it reveals something interesting about us. We like our anxieties served dramatically, yet the old clay may offer something subtler and perhaps more useful. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the true modern echo is not apocalypse, but chronic pressure? Not one final disaster, but the grinding repetition of obligations that never quite stop. Most historians agree that debt became a significant issue in various Mesopotamian societies, especially in later periods where legal and economic texts show concerns over loans, repayment, land service, and personal vulnerability. For the earliest Sumerian layers, the details are more fragmentary, so we should be careful. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It may be too neat to say Sumerian tablets describe modern debt in a direct one-to-one way, but they do belong to a long Mesopotamian world in which grain labour shortage and hierarchy were deeply connected. This raises the possibility that one of civilization's oldest recurring experiences is the feeling of being measured against resources you do not fully control. You move from the storeroom into brighter heat. Outside, a woman balances a jar against her hip. A pair of labourers argue quietly over a load. A supervisor glances toward the scribes, with the face of a man who would very much like reality to match the report. The city looks functional from a distance, but up close it runs on delicate calibrations. Too little water and harvests shrink. Too much water and fields suffer differently. Labour diverted here means shortage there. Storehouses full bring calm. Storehouses thin bring rumour. A careful reading might suggest that economic stress in such a world was not just about numbers, but about atmosphere. Anxiety travels faster than grain. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented parts, though, are already enough to make the ancient world feel close. Barley counted out in careful measures, work assigned, goods tracked, obligations remembered, scarcity hovering just beyond the next season. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot hear each ordinary person's internal monologue as they received a ration or faced a shortage. We do not know every sigh, every quiet fear, every muttered complaint. But the tablets preserve the outlines of a world where economics was personal long before economists existed. And as you stand in the warm dust, watching another fresh tablet lifted to dry, you begin to feel that the oldest clay records do not whisper about the present because they foresaw our exact systems. They whisper because they preserve the first written traces of a truth that still presses on human life now. You can build cities, write laws, raise temples, praise kings, and chart the movements of rivers. But sooner or later, somebody still has to ask the hardest, ordinary question in the world. Will there be enough, and who will carry the burden if there is not? That question lingers in the air as you move on, because once a city begins counting resources, it also begins counting people, and once it begins counting people, work itself starts to change shape. No longer just the rhythm of a household or a small cluster of neighbours helping one another through the season, labour in Sumer can swell into something larger, more organised, more efficient and more exhausting in a way that feels eerily familiar. The sun climbs higher now, and the city's softer dawn mood gives way to the businesslike brightness of a full working day. You can hear it before you fully see it: baskets thudding down, tools scraping plaster, and wood animals snorting under loads, overseers calling directions, scribes pressing styluses into clay, with all the romance of a modern spreadsheet. Most historians agree that temple households and other major institutions in Mesopotamia organised labour on a large scale. Archaeology suggests that this coordination helped build, store, irrigate, manufacture, and sustain the life of the city. And once again, the modern echo is not in some hidden prophecy, but in the system itself. You pass a group of workers heading toward a canal line with hose and baskets. Their feet kick up pale dust that clings to their ankles. Their clothes are practical, their faces already set in the expression of people who know exactly how long the day is going to feel. A careful reading might suggest that institutional labour in Sumer resembles an early form of bureaucracy, not because it looks identical to modern office life, but because it depends on scheduling allocation, supervision, record keeping, and the slow conversion of human effort into visible outputs. A city does not rise by accident. Somebody is always carrying the mud brick. What's broadly accepted is that large Mesopotamian institutions, especially temples and palaces, in various periods mobilise workforces for agriculture, construction, textile production, storage and maintenance. Some people laboured as dependents, tied to institutional households. Others may have moved in and out of these systems through obligations, service, seasonal work, or status-based expectations. The evidence we do have points to a world where work was increasingly coordinated beyond the family unit. One interpretation is that this is one of civilization's great turning points. Human beings become components in a larger productive design. That can sound dramatic, so let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient workers were still people with households, needs, rituals, jokes, soreness, and probably strong opinions about supervisors. They were not little cogs who woke up eager to become part of a management diagram. But the institutions around them did begin to treat labour as something measurable and assignable. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every local setting, yet it fits much of the administrative evidence. Once writing, storage and authority converge, work becomes legible to power in a new way. You stop beside a courtyard where women sit spinning and preparing textile work under partial shade. Nearby, others sort materials, carry water, or move finished goods towards storage. Elsewhere, men labour on walls, canals, transport, and fields. Most historians agree that textile production was a major part of Mesopotamian institutional economy, and archaeology suggests that specialised labour was already deeply embedded in urban life. The scene is practical, repetitive, and oddly mesmerising. Hands move, fibres twist, baskets shift, instructions pass from person to person. No one calls it workflow optimization, which is honestly kind of refreshing, but the logic is there all the same. Historians still argue whether these labour systems should be understood primarily as cooperative, redistributive structures that provided security, or as increasingly coercive arrangements that extracted effort while reinforcing hierarchy. There's no full consensus, and the answer likely varied by time, place, and status. That uncertainty matters because the mood of the system changes depending on where you stand inside it. For an elite administrator organisation may look like stability. For a worker hauling mud brick in the heat, it may look more like endless instructions issued by people whose hands are suspiciously clean. The city itself seems to breathe through these coordinated movements. Grain is hauled because fields were worked. Walls stand because mud was mixed and lifted. Temples loom because bricks were shaped, dried, stacked and repaired. Canals function because someone cleared silt from them again and again and again, which may be one of the least glamorous jobs in world history. There is no statue of the exhausted canal cleaner in your school textbooks, and frankly, there should be. Civilization has always depended on people doing the tasks no poet wants to romanticize. One interpretation is that these tablets and labour records feel so current because they reveal an uncomfortable truth. Complex societies often admire the finished result more than the bodies that make it possible. The temple shines, the wall endures, the storehouse fills, the inscription praises order. Meanwhile, somebody has gone home with an aching back and a ration measured by someone else's stylus. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the oldest urban records are already teaching you how systems convert invisible effort into visible permanence? A fringe idea proposes that the scale of ancient construction in Mesopotamia must have relied on lost technologies or outside intervention, because modern imaginations often underestimate what disciplined labour time and organisation can accomplish. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the more cautious explanation could be that human beings are perfectly capable of building impressive things with simple tools when enough hands, authority and necessity are brought together. That may be less flashy than aliens or vanished machines, but it is far more supported by evidence, and in its own way it is more unsettling. The real power may not be secret knowledge. It may be administration plus labour plus no realistic way to opt out. You walk alongside a canal cut through the landscape like a firm sentence. The banks are trampled. Reeds bend near the edges. Men with baskets scrape silt and dump it away from the flow. The sun glints off the water with the sort of beauty that makes hard work look briefly poetic, which is convenient because hard work appreciates any public relations it can get. Archaeology suggests that irrigation required ongoing maintenance, and what's broadly accepted is that these systems demanded collective labour and careful oversight. A city that eats through stored grain quickly learns to value boring maintenance more than grand speeches, even if grand speeches get the better inscriptions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Still, the documented parts are enough to give the day a very recognisable texture. Work is scheduled, bodies are assigned, output matters, supervisors track, institutions absorb and redirect effort. A careful reading might suggest that the emotional consequence is also familiar. Repetition settles over the day. Time belongs less to the worker than to the task. Individual energy is poured into something larger that may offer belonging, survival, identity, or resentment, sometimes all four before lunch. You can almost hear a labourer mutter the ancient equivalent of, "This could have been a message, not a meeting, though perhaps with more references to reeds and fewer to calendars." The joke lands because the rhythm of organised work has changed, less than people might like to think. Technology evolves, management vocabulary becomes more annoying, yet the basic structure remains oddly durable. A group is assigned, a target is set, a record is made. The result is praise from above and felt from below. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We do not always know how workers understood their place within these systems. Some may have experienced institutional labour as security and shared ritual. Others may have experienced it as pressure and limitation. Likely many lived somewhere in between, because human beings are excellent at adapting to arrangements they did not choose. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities required extraordinary coordination to survive. One interpretation is that this coordination produced the first recognisable taste of life inside a machine built from people. And so you keep walking through the full bright day of Sumer, where hands keep moving and tablets keep drying, and no wall canal or temple exists without somebody's repeated effort pressed invisibly into it. The old records do not need to predict modern offices or factories to feel startlingly close. They only need to show you a city where labour has become organised, measured, and folded into systems larger than the individual. 5,000 years later, the tools are different, the buildings are taller, and the jargon is much worse, but the sensation is still there. Work becomes a machine, and you learn as people learned then how to keep walking inside its steady hum. The steady hum of work follows you out of the brighter courtyards and canal paths and into a quieter corner of the city where the noise changes character. It becomes less collective and more personal, less the sound of institutions moving bodies, and more the sound of individuals rubbing against one another in all the small, abrasive ways that make society possible and deeply tiring. Somewhere nearby, a goat protests an injustice no one else can identify. A child cries, is comforted, then immediately finds a new reason to cry, which is a talent every civilization seems to produce on schedule. In a shaded room, a scribe bends over a tablet, not to count grain this time, but to preserve a message, a complaint, a grievance, a human irritation made durable in clay. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia has left behind personal letters, school exercises, legal records, and disputes that bring ancient personalities startlingly close. One interpretation is that their annoyance sounds modern, because frustration is one of the most stable human traditions on earth. You step through a threshold into the cooler air of a modest administrative room. The walls are plain mud brick. Light enters in a dusty shaft from above. Reed baskets sit along one wall holding tablets in different states of dryness, each one a hard little witness to someone's problem. The scribe at work presses careful wedges as another man dictates with the kind of intense dignity people always adopt when describing how badly they have been wronged. A careful reading might suggest that writing in Mesopotamia did more than run institutions. It also gave people a way to formalise displeasure, which is perhaps one of the most relatable uses of literacy imaginable. What's broadly accepted is that the broader Mesopotamian world, including later periods beyond early Sumer itself, preserves famous complaint texts, legal disputes, private letters, and records of conflict over property, goods, service, and behaviour. The evidence we do have points to a society where human beings were not serenely accepting their lot under the stars. They argued, they objected, they accused, they tried to get compensation, they asked why promised things had not arrived. In other words, they behaved exactly like people standing at the customer service desk of history. The most famous example from later Mesopotamia, though not from Sumer proper, is the old Babylonian complaint of Nani to Nasir about poor quality copper. Most historians agree this text survives as one of antiquity's sharpest little flashes of consumer frustration. It is not evidence that Sumerians were writing one-star reviews in exactly the same way, so we should be careful. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It does not prove a direct line from ancient clay complaints to your modern rage at a delayed package, but it raises the possibility that once trade promises and records exist, disappointment becomes a genre. And that genre feels surprisingly alive. You imagine the dictated words hardening into clay as the complainant explains that the goods were not what they should have been, that the treatment was disrespectful, that the whole arrangement has been offensive to common standards of decency and commerce. Somewhere in the background, another scribe may already be hearing an unrelated case involving property boundaries, labour obligations, or whose goat has once again trespassed in a manner that no longer feels accidental. Archaeology suggests that formal record keeping touched many aspects of life, and one interpretation is that this made social friction more visible rather than less. Writing does not remove conflict. It gives conflict a filing system. Historians still argue whether literacy in Mesopotamia should be imagined as narrowly concentrated among specialists or more flexibly distributed through administrative, commercial and legal networks over time. There is no full consensus, and the answer changed across centuries. But even if scribes carried much of the technical burden, the emotional force behind these records belonged to ordinary human situations. Someone felt cheated, someone felt ignored, someone believed procedure had failed. That is not prophecy, that is society. There is something almost soothing in the pettiness of it, though that may sound unfair to the ancient complainants. After kings and floods and labour systems, the private grievance has a domestic charm. A shipment was poor, a service was inadequate, a neighbour crossed a line, a relative failed a duty. It is a reminder that history is not only made of empires and catastrophes. It is also made of exasperated people trying to explain very clearly that this is not what was agreed. A fringe idea proposes that certain complaint or legal tablets contain hidden symbolic messages about the collapse of moral order in our own age. And as always, this theory becomes much less persuasive the moment you imagine the original writer mostly just wanting a refund. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does reveal something interesting. Modern readers often crave apocalyptic significance, where the ancient text may be offering something more grounded and honestly funnier. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real modern echo is simply that bureaucracy creates new opportunities for disappointment, and people rapidly become experts in documenting that disappointment? The room around you smells of clay reed, fibres, dust, warm skin and lamp soot. The tablet stacks are neat in the way systems prefer to be neat even when the lives inside them are not. A careful reading might suggest that personal grievances preserved in Mesopotamian texts reveal a society already full of negotiated expectations. Goods should match standards. Promises should be kept. Authorities should respond. Transactions should be fair. A more cautious explanation could be that fairness itself was understood differently, then filtered through hierarchy, status and local custom. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the emotional outline is easy to recognise. People are perfectly capable of feeling insulted across any technological level. Most historians agree that legal traditions in Mesopotamia grew complex over time, preserving contracts, disputes, witness statements and formal judgments. What's broadly accepted is that social life produced enough friction to require constant adjudication. One interpretation is that this tells you something important about civilization. The moment you create records, offices and procedures, you also create the hope that wrongs can be addressed, along with the equally ancient suspicion that they probably will not be addressed fast enough. You smile a little sleepily, imagining an impatient merchant insisting that the complaint be written exactly as spoken. No softening, no polite trimming, no diplomatic flourish. It is a human scene, and that may be why it feels close. Not because ancient Mesopotamians were secretly just like modern people in every way. They were not. Their world was harsher, more hierarchical, more sacred in its public logic, and often less private than ours. But the evidence we do have points to a familiar pulse underneath all that difference. People notice unfairness quickly, especially when it costs them something tangible. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented parts already do enough. They show that 5,000 years ago, or in the long Mesopotamian centuries that followed, people were not only building cities and honouring gods, they were also lodging complaints, pursuing disputes, and preserving irritation in forms sturdy enough to outlast dynasties. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot hear tone of voice perfectly. We cannot always recover sarcasm, wounded pride, or that special kind of pause people use before saying, with all due respect to meaning precisely the opposite, but the clay catches enough. And as you leave the room and step back into the hot light of the lane, you carry with you the oddly comforting thought that formalised annoyance may be one of humanity's most durable achievements. The old tablets do not need to predict your inbox, your service disputes, or your politely worded complaints that are not polite at all. They only need to show that once people begin trading, working, promising, and recording frustration becomes part of the written record too. Civilization keeps its monuments, yes. It also keeps its arguments. And sometimes tucked inside the dustiest shelves of history, that is where the ancient world feels most alive. You leave the complaints behind, though, not the mood entirely, because irritation and uncertainty tend to travel well. And now the city begins to tilt your gaze upward. The lanes are still there. The dust, the labour, the storehouses, the half-heard arguments. But above them stretches a sky that ancient Mesopotamians watched with extraordinary care. By late afternoon, the light has gone softer, and the first thought of evening begins to gather along the edges of roofs and courtyards. Birds wheel, smoke thins upward. A breeze moves across the higher terraces. Somewhere, perhaps on a raised platform or temple roof, a watcher lifts his eyes to the heavens and tries to read in them not just beauty but pattern. Most historians agree that celestial observation mattered deeply across Mesopotamian culture, especially in later Babylonian traditions built on earlier foundations. One interpretation is that omen texts feel modern because they reveal a timeless human urge to forecast uncertainty before uncertainty embarrasses us in public. You climb in imagination toward a higher place above the city, where the air is clearer and the sounds below blend into a low, almost soothing murmur. From here, the streets look smaller, the walls more orderly, the people less individual and more like moving marks in a great living tablet. Overhead, the sky deepens from pale gold toward blue-grey. Stars will come soon. The moon will rise in its time. Planets, if you know how to recognise them, will hold their patient paths. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian scholars paid close attention to recurring celestial phenomena, and what's broadly accepted is that this observation became increasingly systematic over centuries. That matters because ancient skywatching is often misunderstood in two equally unhelpful ways. Some modern readers flatten it into pure superstition, as though no careful observation could exist inside a sacred framework. Others inflate it into secret advanced science that predicted everything from modern geopolitics to your social anxiety. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian omen traditions combine genuine attention to regular patterns with interpretive systems designed to manage fear, decision-making, and the unknown. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every context, but it fits the evidence better than either extreme. You picture a scholar priest or trained observer noting the moon's appearance, the behaviour of stars, the strange flare of a planet near the horizon, perhaps even the occurrence of an eclipse. In later Mesopotamian records, celestial omens could be tied to kingship harvests, political stability, or danger. Most historians agree that texts linking heavenly signs to earthly events became highly developed. One interpretation is that this feels uncannily familiar because modern societies also stare at charts, models, forecasts, and probability maps, trying to tame tomorrow by reading patterns today. Different tools, same pulse. Historians still argue whether we should emphasize continuity between early Sumerian religious skywatching and the more formalized omen sciences of later Mesopotamia, or whether the differences across time are more important than the similarities. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty deserves respect. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The earliest Sumerian records do not hand you a complete astrological handbook for the modern age. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It would be too neat to claim that a 5,000-year-old tablet straightforwardly describes your headlines, your weather map, or your market panic. But these traditions do preserve something deeply durable, the instinct to search the heavens for reassurance when life below feels unstable. And life below often does feel unstable. From the rooftop, you can see storage yards, workshops, courtyards, temple walls, and the darker line of water beyond. Every part of the city depends on forces that remain only partly controllable. Floods, crop yields, disease, labour. Rival cities, leadership, luck. Under those conditions, the sky becomes more than scenery. It becomes a screen on which anxiety is projected and disciplined. A careful reading might suggest that omen texts were not only about prediction, they were also about emotional management. If a sign can be named, interpreted, discussed, and richly addressed, then uncertainty becomes at least slightly less wild. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if ancient celestial records feel current? Not because they predicted our specific moment, but because they reveal a permanent human compromise. You may not be able to control the future, but you can watch for hints. You can gather patterns. You can compare previous cycles. You can tell yourself that the universe leaves clues. That impulse is older than almost anything written. There is, of course, a fringe idea that Mesopotamian sky lore preserves literal knowledge of extraterrestrial visitors, coded star maps to lost civilizations, or hidden calendars foretelling the collapse of modern society. A fringe idea proposes that the tablets are less about observation and more about a secret inheritance from beings who already understood the fate of Earth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the night sky invites grand conclusions, especially when looked at by people who would very much like mystery to come with subtitles. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a gentler truth still remains. The heavens have always made human beings feel small, and smallness tends to produce imaginative theories at impressive speed. Below you, the city is easing into evening. Lamps begin to glow. A donkey complains from somewhere unseen with the heroic self-confidence donkeys bring to all public remarks. Cooking smells rise into the air. Voices soften. The first star appears. Then another. The watcher beside you, or the figure you imagine there, does not see these lights as decorative. He sees data wrapped in meaning. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholars, especially in later periods, made sophisticated observations of recurring celestial events. What's broadly accepted is that their work was both empirical and interpretive. They tracked the sky carefully, but they also asked what it meant for life on Earth. And that question has never really gone away. Modern people may prefer algorithms, economic indicators, satellite feeds, and probability curves, but the underlying wish is recognizable. Please let the signs mean something. Please let tomorrow be legible. Please let uncertainty behave itself. One interpretation is that omen texts speak to the same deep desire that drives every forecast addiction today. Not a lust for magic necessarily, but a refusal to sit passively in the dark. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented parts already show enough to make the sky feel strangely close. Ancient observers looked up with disciplined memory and expectation. They noticed repetition. They linked signs to consequences. They folded celestial order into earthly worry. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot fully recover how each observer balanced reverence, fear, curiosity, and confidence. We do not know exactly how the night felt in every chest. But the texts suggest a world where the sky mattered because uncertainty mattered. A more cautious explanation could be that omen systems offered less predictive accuracy than psychological structure, less certainty than a framework for acting under doubt. That may sound underwhelming until you realise how much of human culture works exactly the same way. Rituals, forecasts, headlines, graphs, trends, signs, updates. Civilization keeps inventing ways to look ahead without ever fully seeing ahead. The names change, the appetite does not. So you remain on the rooftop a little longer. As the stars multiply over the city, sharp above, the mud brick and river haze and the old feeling settles in. Not terror, not revelation, something quieter. A sense that 5,000 years ago people were already doing what you still do now. Looking upward when the world feels uncertain, searching for pattern, hoping the signs arrive in time. The tablets do not need to predict your century word for word to feel alive. They only need to show that the oldest written civilizations already knew one of humanity's favourite nighttime habits. When the ground feels unstable, you study the sky and call it wisdom. The stars remain above you for a while, but eventually even the most attentive watcher has to come back down from the roof, back into the lanes, back toward the world of bodies and breath, and all the small failures of flesh that no omen can fully prevent. The city below is quieter now, though not asleep. Lamps glow behind doorways. A dog scratches itself with philosophical commitment. Somewhere a baby protests existence with tremendous confidence. The breeze carries traces of smoke, baked grain, damp earth, and something bitter from a mortar where herbs have been crushed. Most historians agree that in ancient Mesopotamia, healing involved both practical remedies and spiritual or ritual elements. One interpretation is that this feels familiar, because modern people, for all their machines and medicine cabinets, still reach for meaning as quickly as they reach for treatment. You follow the smell of ground plants and warm oil into a dim room where illness is being tended with calm seriousness. The walls are close and plain. A lamp flame trembles in a niche. Bowls, cloths, jars, and small bundles of dried herbs sit on a reed mat beside the patient. A healer, or perhaps more than one, works with careful hands. This is not a gleaming clinic with stainless steel and polite forms on a clipboard. You probably would not survive this visit very elegantly if you arrive with your modern expectations of refrigeration antibiotics and internet symptom searches that end with you briefly suspecting you have 11 rare conditions at once. Still, the room has its own order, and it would be a mistake to imagine the ancient world as nothing but helpless superstition. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian healing traditions combined empirical observations, practical treatments, incantations, and ritual acts. Different kinds of healers seem to have operated within this world, sometimes emphasizing remedies and diagnosis, sometimes emphasizing ritual purification or spiritual causes. Archaeology suggests that people use plants, oils, poultices, washes and other physical interventions, while textual evidence from later Mesopotamia shows elaborate medical and incantation traditions. A more cautious explanation could be that for early Sumer itself, the evidence is less complete than for later Akkadian and Babylonian sources, so we should avoid pretending we have a perfect bedside transcript from 5,000 years ago. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but the broader Mesopotamian pattern is clear enough. And it is a very human pattern. You kneel in imagination at least near the doorway and watch the healer inspect the patient's face, breathing, skin and posture. Questions may be asked. Substances may be mixed. Words may be spoken over the body as well as applied to it. One interpretation is that this blend of medicine and meaning feels modern, not because the methods are identical, but because people still hate the idea that pain is random. When you are unwell, you want treatment, yes, but you also want narrative. Why this sickness? Why now? What caused it? What it says about your body, your habits, your fate. Human beings are rarely satisfied with symptoms alone. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian approaches to illness should be divided neatly between rational medicine and magical belief, or whether that modern distinction distorts how ancient people understood the body. There is no full consensus, and honestly, the divide may have felt much less real to them than it does to us. A careful reading might suggest that the healer's room is a place where practical and symbolic actions support each other. A wash can clean, a salve can soothe, an incantation can calm fear, shape attention, and place suffering inside a framework the patient can endure. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But where the evidence is stronger, it points to a world in which cure and meaning were close companions. You notice the smell more clearly now. Resin, crushed leaves, warm oil, sweat, smoke, clay, and the sharp note of something bitter enough to make the tongue recoil. It is intimate work healing. Hands touch the body, eyes study small changes. The room narrows around the patient's discomfort. Outside the city continues its business of labour, trade, authority, and ritual. Inside everything has shrunk to a pulse, a fever, a cough, a swelling, a wound, a weakness. Most historians agree that illness in ancient Mesopotamia could be interpreted through multiple lenses at once: environmental, bodily, divine, moral, and social. What's broadly accepted is that disease was not merely a private inconvenience. It touched family, work, ritual, purity, and public order. That also feels uncomfortably current. A careful reading might suggest that ancient medical texts and healing practices echo the present because modern people do not actually live by biology alone either. They trust doctors and still ask what stress is doing to them. They accept prescriptions and still want reassurance. They study charts and still search for hidden causes in personality fate or cosmic timing. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This is not to say Mesopotamian healing anticipated modern medicine in a direct, linear way. It did not. The differences are enormous, and many ancient treatments would have been ineffective or risky by modern standards. But it raises the possibility that one of the oldest human constants is the refusal to separate the body entirely from meaning. A fringe idea proposes that ancient Mesopotamian healers possessed secret biomedical knowledge far beyond the official history of medicine, and every so often someone reads a damaged line about herbs or symptoms and declares the whole pharmaceutical industry 5,000 years late. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because people love the romance of lost mastery. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something gentler appears instead. The old medical traditions may not hide miraculous cures, but they do preserve a deep attentiveness to suffering, and that in its own modest way is profound. The patient shifts. The healer adjusts a cloth. A whispered phrase passes through the room, low and rhythmic, the sort of speech meant to settle breath as much as spirits. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot reconstruct every diagnosis with confidence. We do not always know which treatments worked, which failed, which comforted, which harmed, or how patients understood the balance between the physical and the sacred. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Still, even the documented parts show that Mesopotamian people responded to illness with systems of care, not mere resignation. You think too of epidemics, poor sanitation, parasites, injuries, childbirth, complications, and all the ordinary bodily troubles of ancient urban life. Most historians agree that dense settlements created serious health pressures in the ancient world. Water quality, waste, crowding labour strain, and nutrition all shaped outcomes. One interpretation is that healing traditions became more important precisely because city life made vulnerability impossible to ignore. A city promises protection, abundance, ritual exchange, and identity. It also hands you new ways to get sick. There is a sleepy sort of joke in that, though perhaps the body does not appreciate it. Humanity builds its first great urban systems, and the reward is paperwork hierarchy and pathogens sharing the neighbourhood. Civilization really does insist on being a package deal. But inside the healer's room, the joke softens. What remains is care, someone mixing remedies, someone watching closely, someone trying with the tools available to pull another person back toward balance. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not hidden prophecy, not a coded medical manual for the future, but a reminder that old civilizations were already wrestling with a problem that never leaves. The body fails, the mind worries, communities respond with whatever knowledge, ritual and tenderness they can assemble. The clay tablets do not need to describe your pharmacy shelf, your wellness culture, or your midnight symptom panic to feel relevant. They only need to show that 5,000 years ago people were already trying to heal with both substance and story, because pain almost always asks for both. And so you step back out into the lane where the night air feels cooler against your skin, and the city resumes its low murmur around you. Somewhere above the stars still hang, somewhere behind the healer's lamp burns on, and between those two lights, earthly and distant, you sense the continuity quietly settling in. Ancient records remain alive, not because they solved illness once and for all, but because they reveal something you still know now. When the body falters, human beings search not only for a cure, but for a way to make the suffering feel less alone. When you leave the healer's room, the city seems gentler for a moment, as if pain has narrowed your attention and sharpened your hearing. The lane outside is not empty, but it feels thinned out, its daytime urgency softened into evening routine. Lamps burn behind doorways. Footsteps come and go with less purpose now. A distant conversation rises, then dissolves. Somewhere a pot lid rattles. Somewhere a reed flute tries out a phrase and then thinks better of it. The air smells of cooling brick smoke, stale grain, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of something baking in a courtyard oven. Most historians agree that life in ancient Mesopotamian cities brought people into dense and often unequal social worlds. One interpretation is that the old laments and social texts feel strikingly current, because urban life, for all its noise, has always been capable of producing loneliness. That loneliness is not simple solitude. You are surrounded here. The houses stand close. The walls are thin. People pass within arm's reach. Work, ritual, trade, family obligation, and authority press human beings constantly against one another. And yet a careful reading might suggest that proximity is not the same thing as belonging. A city can gather thousands into one place and still leave many feeling unseen. That is a possibility, not a certainty in every case, but it is hard to miss once you begin looking for it. The more elaborate the social order becomes, the more it seems to sort rank, compare and separate. You move through a residential quarter where mud brick homes cluster in uneven rows, their doorways dark and their roof lines cutting simple shapes against the night. Some courtyards glow with activity, others sit quiet. Somewhere a family shares food. Somewhere a labourer sleeps heavily after a punishing day. Somewhere an older person sits awake longer than the others, listening to the city settle, perhaps thinking thoughts no tablet will ever preserve. Archaeology suggests domestic spaces in Mesopotamian cities were compact and close together, with household life unfolding in intimate, practical arrangements. What's broadly accepted is that urban living was highly social, but highly social does not always mean emotionally warm. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes laments, prayers, and wisdom texts that give voice to vulnerability, grief, injustice, abandonment, and personal distress. Some belong to royal or communal traditions, some to scribal teaching, some to later periods in the long Mesopotamian world. One interpretation is that these texts preserve not only public crisis but private emotional weather. They show people wrestling with the unsettling experience of living inside systems larger than themselves. A careful reading might suggest that loneliness can appear not only when no one is near, but when everyone nearby belongs to a structure that does not fully hold your inner life. Historians still argue whether we should read Mesopotamian laments primarily as ritual performances shaped by formal conventions, or also as windows into lived feelings that individuals recognise deeply. There is no full consensus, and the answer is likely both. That matters because ancient texts are never raw diary entries in the modern sense. They are crafted, repeated, taught, framed by genre. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We cannot simply pick up a lament and claim we are hearing an untouched private confession from a person in a room, but that does not make the emotion unreal. Formal language can still carry genuine human ache. You pass a small open space where neighbours talk in low tones before parting for the night. One of them laughs, but the laugh lands oddly and fades quickly. Another lingers a little too long after the others go inside. The scene is tiny, almost nothing, and perhaps that is why it feels so familiar. The evidence we do have points to ancient cities as places of intense interdependence, hierarchy, and pressure. One interpretation is that such environments naturally produce comparison and isolation alongside connection. Someone always has more grain. Someone has better standing. Someone has access to the temple, the palace, the official, the patron, the right family network. Someone else does not. The city in that sense can make you feel very small, not romantically small, beneath the stars, but administratively small, socially small, economically small. You are one more body in a counted world, one more worker, one more dependent, one more petitioner, one more household, inside a machine of obligations. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if one of the oldest experiences of civilization is not simply community, but the strange ache of being crowded without being fully held? A fringe idea proposes that certain Sumerian and later Mesopotamian laments encode knowledge of a civilization-wide spiritual alienation that exactly mirrors modern loneliness, as though ancient poets were secretly diagnosing social media before the invention of chairs with decent back support. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it's probably asking too much of the evidence. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the softer truth remains. Old cities appear to have known that collective life carries emotional costs. Structure brings security, ritual exchange, and identity. It also brings exclusion, comparison, and quiet sorrow. You think of the lament traditions tied to ruined cities and broken favour, where whole communities speak of abandonment, disorder, and divine distance. Most historians agree that city laments became an important part of Mesopotamian literary culture, especially in relation to loss and catastrophe. What's broadly accepted is that these texts often address communal suffering, yet one interpretation is that even large-scale laments resonate because they borrow the language of personal grief. A city mourns like a person. A temple is forsaken like a friend. Order leaves like companionship. The scale may be public, but the emotional grammar is intimate. An intimate emotion has a way of outliving its original context. You do not need to inhabit a Sumerian street to understand the feeling of being surrounded by other lives and still carrying something private and heavy. You do not need to share their gods, their economy, or their architecture to recognize the sensation of belonging to a place that functions without necessarily comforting you. A more cautious explanation could be that modern modern loneliness is shaped by conditions ancient people never knew, including different notions of individuality, privacy, and selfhood. That's true and worth remembering. But the clay and the literature still raise the possibility that urban isolation is much older than modern language for it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented parts already carry enough weight. Dense neighbourhoods, social rank, institutional power, laments of abandonment, prayers of distress, wisdom literature that acknowledges instability and injustice. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot recover every individual silence in the ancient city. We cannot know exactly who lay awake, feeling overlooked, trapped, ashamed, or simply tired in the soul. But the surviving texts suggest those feelings would not have been unimaginable there. There is even a thin, sleepy joke hiding inside that truth. Human beings invent the city to escape isolation, danger, and scarcity, and then promptly discover that living close together introduces brand new ways to feel emotionally stranded. It is a remarkable bit of species consistency. Build walls, canals, temples, and markets, and somehow you still end up staring into the night, wondering whether anyone really sees you. Civilization is nothing if not ambitious. The lane narrows again as you walk on. A light goes out behind one doorway. Another appears farther ahead. Somewhere someone sings a line too quietly to catch. Somewhere else a child wakes and is hushed back into sleep. The whole city seems to hover between presence and absence, crowded and lonely at once. Ancient records do not need to predict modern alienation with magical precision to feel close. They only need to show that 5,000 years ago people were already living in environments where human closeness did not always cure human ache. And that may be one of the most hauntingly gentle things the old world offers tonight. Not proof, not hidden revelation, just recognition. The first cities may already have known that the crowd cannot solve everything, that order does not guarantee comfort, and that a person can live in the very heart of civilization and still feel in some quiet interior room completely alone. That quiet interior room stays with you as you walk on, but the city will not let you remain entirely inside yourself for long. Beyond the clustered houses and dim courtyards, beyond the lamplit doorways and the half-heard songs, the larger landscape waits with its own patient demands. In Sumer, the city is never truly separate from the fields, the canals, the marshes, the shifting banks, and the salty breath of the soil itself. Even at night, the land is working on the future. Water is moving somewhere, silt is settling somewhere, a ditch is clogging somewhere, a bank is weakening somewhere. Most historians agree that irrigation was essential to life in southern Mesopotamia, and archaeology suggests that its long-term management brought both prosperity and risk. One interpretation is that these old records feel current because they capture a truth modern people keep rediscovering with fresh surprise. The environment that sustains a civilization can also quietly destabilize it. You leave the tighter urban quarter behind and move out toward the edge, where the built world loosens into agricultural space. The moonlight now lies across canals in pale strips. Reeds rustle. Frogs or insects make their small, insistent noises near the waterline. The smell is layered and unmistakable. Wet silt, trampled vegetation, stagnant patches, damp earth, distant smoke, and the mineral tang of irrigation water drying on the land. It is beautiful in a practical way, and that practicality matters. What's broadly accepted is that the southern Mesopotamian environment did not offer effortless abundance. Productive agriculture depended on coordination, maintenance, and constant adjustment. The evidence we do have points to a world where environmental success was engineered but never guaranteed. A careful reading might suggest that this engineered success contained its own hidden strain. Irrigation brings life, but over time it can also bring problems. Waterlogging, salinisation, the gradual accumulation of salts in the soil that can reduce crop yields and force shifts in what can be grown successfully. Most historians agree that long-term environmental pressures affected parts of ancient Mesopotamia, though the timing scale and causes of particular changes are still debated. Historians still argue whether salinisation should be treated as a central driver of major political and social shifts in Sumer, or as one factor among many interacting with climate variability, conflict administration and regional change. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty is worth keeping close. You crouch beside a field channel and touch the crusted edge where dampness has dried. The earth is cool now, but the memory of heat remains in it. Somewhere nearby, barley stands in ordered rows. Elsewhere, perhaps, farmers have had to adapt to changing conditions, choosing crops more suited to stressed soil. Archaeology suggests that agricultural patterns in Mesopotamia shifted over time, and one interpretation is that these changes reflect not only politics and trade, but environmental pressure accumulating so slowly that no single generation fully sees the whole curve. That may be one of the most unsettling kinds of danger. Not the sudden flood everyone can point to, but the gradual decline that arrives one season at a time until somebody finally says, with great exhaustion, this used to work better. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a simple warning? Tablet saying the modern climate crisis was foretold in cuneiform because that would be too neat and far too certain. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient Sumerian records do not provide a direct blueprint for your present environmental debates. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we should not pretend otherwise. But they do raise the possibility that ecological fragility is not some brand new modern plot twist. Civilization has always depended on landscapes that require care, and landscapes have always had opinions of their own. The canal beside you glimmers faintly as a breeze troubles the surface. Somewhere farther off, a worker may still be checking embankments or clearing a section that cannot be left to mourning. Large systems need endless attention. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian irrigation demanded labour coordination and institutional oversight. One interpretation is that this is where environmental history begins to feel deeply modern. The more successful a society becomes at controlling its surroundings, the more vulnerable it may become to the failure of that control. Build enough life around managed water, and managed water becomes a condition of everything. There is a sleepy little irony in that. Human beings gaze proudly at a flourishing field and think they have mastered nature while nature stands just behind them, adjusting the salinity with the patience of a tax collector. It is not dramatic enough for most myths, perhaps, but it is devastatingly effective. Crops thin, yields change, labour demands increase, food pressure grows, administrators count harder, people worry more. No thunderbolt required. A fringe idea proposes that Sumerian environmental decline was caused not by ordinary ecological strain, but by catastrophic cosmic cycles, hidden technologies gone wrong or lost, geophysical events erased from mainstream history. This theory isn't widely accepted, though it circulates, because gradual causes do not satisfy the part of the mind that wants one giant secret lever behind everything. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something more grounded and perhaps more haunting remains. The real mystery may be how often civilizations weaken, not from one dramatic blow, but from cumulative stresses they struggle to measure while living inside them. The evidence we do have points to a landscape that rewarded organised effort and punished neglect, but also one where even effort could create new complications over time. A more cautious explanation could be that environmental change in Mesopotamia varied regionally and should not be reduced to one universal story of decline. That matters because ancient history rarely behaves as neatly as the documentaries want. Some areas adapted, Some systems endured. Some political centres rose while others weakened. Still, the broad pattern is enough to feel familiar. Human prosperity often sits on ecological arrangements that are both productive and precarious. You continue along the canal and see in imagination a line of workers carrying tools for repair. They move slowly in the moonlight, the kind of slow that belongs not to laziness but to repetition. Maintenance again, always maintenance. Civilization keeps pretending its greatness lies in monuments, but archaeology suggests it often lies in ditches, embankments, channels, and the unglamorous work of keeping water where it should be. What's broadly accepted is that canal systems were central to Mesopotamian life. One interpretation is that the true drama of Sumer is not only in kings and temples, but in infrastructure, which is admittedly less cinematic until your crops fail. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented parts already do enough. They show a world where human order depended on environmental management, and where that management carried long-term consequences. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot calculate every ancient season. We cannot map every canal exactly as it changed. We cannot always tell whether a shortfall came from local mismanagement, wider climate variation, social disruption, or some blend of all three. But the broad lesson remains suggestive, not conclusive. Civilization rests on fragile agreements with land and water. And perhaps that is why the old clay feels so alive here at the edge of the fields. Not because it predicted your exact headlines about drought, heat, or instability, but because it preserves an earlier version of the same uneasy truth. A society may look strong in its walls, temples, and records, while its environmental foundation grows more delicate beneath it. The city hums, the ledgers fill, the rulers speak confidently. Meanwhile, the soil changes by degrees too small for speeches. By the time you turn back toward the distant lights of the city, the canal is almost black under the night sky, and the reeds whisper in a language older than any tablet. You realise then that ancient records do not need to deliver a prophecy of modern crisis to feel current. They only need to show that 5,000 years ago, people were already living inside a bargain with nature that could sustain them magnificently and fail them quietly. And if that sounds familiar now, it may be because human beings have always preferred to notice environmental limits only after building something large enough to depend on them completely. From the dark edge of the fields, you make your way back toward the city, where the walls rise again out of the night like a patient certainty people have agreed to believe in. The canal sounds fade behind you, though not entirely, because in a place like this, the environment never truly stops whispering. But now another kind of uncertainty returns to the foreground. Not water, not soil, not illness. Other people, other cities, other rulers staring across the same flat land and deciding that stability would look much nicer if it belonged to them instead. Most historians agree that conflict shaped the history of Sumerian city-states, and archaeology suggests that walls, inscriptions, weapons and political shifts all point to a world where organised violence and insecurity were familiar facts of life. One interpretation is that these records feel modern, because every age suspects, with some justification, that the wider order may be more fragile than official speeches admit. The city gate ahead is quieter than it was by day, but not asleep. Guards stand watch with spears and tired eyes. A cart creaks inward under a modest load. Somewhere above a torch gutters in the breeze. The smell here is dust, warm brick, sweat, lamp, smoked leather, and the faint metallic tang of blades or fittings kept close in case the night grows difficult. You step through the gate and feel at once how much the wall promises and how much it cannot promise. A wall can slow danger. It cannot remove the idea of danger from human life, and that idea, once it settles into a city, seeps everywhere. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer was not a single unified kingdom in its early phases, but a landscape of city-states such as Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and others, each with its own rulers, institutions, and rivalries. The evidence we do have points to alliances, conflicts, shifting dominance, and periodic warfare. Inscriptions from later early dynastic and related periods often celebrate victories, boundary settlements, temple restorations after conflict, and royal strength. A careful reading might suggest that these texts are not just records of war, but records of insecurity. You do not keep carving triumphs into stone or clay unless defeat is imaginable. Historians still argue whether many royal war inscriptions should be read primarily as propaganda, ritualized declarations of legitimacy, or fairly usable reports of real campaigns shaped by exaggeration. There is no full consensus, and the answer is almost certainly some blend. That matters because power loves a polished version of events. A ruler announces that he crushed enemies, restored order, pleased the gods, and secured the frontier. Perhaps he did some of that. Perhaps he did less. Perhaps the enemy's tablet, had it survived, would sound suspiciously similar with the names rearranged. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts are valuable, but they are not neutral windows. They are shaped by ambition, fear, and the need to appear indispensable. You walk deeper into the city and notice how conflict leaves traces, even when no battle is happening right now. Extra labour on walls, nervous talk in courtyards, supplies counted with sharper attention, officials moving with a touch more urgency. The city, already a machine of work and record-keeping, tightens further under the possibility of war. Most historians agree that walls and fortifications mattered in Mesopotamian urban life, though their exact forms and meanings varied. One interpretation is that city defences were not only practical structures, but emotional ones. They told people that order had an edge, that fear had been considered that someone was standing between them and the unknown beyond the plain. And yet beyond the wall lies not only threat but familiarity. Other cities, other canals, other fields, other gods, named with local intimacy, other rulers convinced of their own righteousness. A more cautious explanation could be that Sumerian conflict was often as much about resources, boundaries, labour, and political status as about simple hatred. Water rights, field lines, tribute prestige, trade routes, temple influence. Human beings do not need dramatic reasons to fight. Modest reasons repeated consistently usually do the job. There is somewhere in the old Mesopotamian record a profoundly modern mood here. Not necessarily the exact details of your present headlines, but the sensation that public order is always one argument away from strain. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the oldest war records feel current, not because they predict our particular century, but because they reveal the same old recipe? Scarcity, pride, competition, sacred language, political theatre, and frightened ordinary people who still have to sleep near the walls, while elites explain the necessity of events. A fringe idea proposes that Sumerian conflicts encode memory of a global ancient war between vastly advanced factions, perhaps even non-human ones, and that the battles between city-states are only the dimmed historical surface of a much older catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because war stories always invite enlargement. They want scale. They want cosmic importance. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though, a quieter truth still holds. Human conflict does not need hidden technology or lost super-civilizations to be consequential. Mud brick walls and reed marshes are enough. Territory and ego are enough. Anxiety and ambition are more than enough. You pass a courtyard where a few men speak in low voices over jars and a lamp. One gestures toward the wall. Another shakes his head slowly. No tablets preserve this exact conversation, of course, but the emotional texture is easy to imagine. Most historians agree that ordinary people in ancient cities bore the costs of instability in direct ways, disrupted labour, insecurity, provisioning pressure, conscription, or service-damaged fields, uncertain trade, fear for households. The evidence we do have points to conflict as more than a royal headline. It seeped downward into the grain jar, the sleep cycle, the family mood. A careful reading might suggest that this is one reason royal triumphal language feels so familiar. Leaders speak of security because insecurity is real. They celebrate walls because walls are needed. They invoke divine favour because public confidence is fragile. One interpretation is that the louder the declaration of order, the more you should remember that order requires maintenance, persuasion, and occasionally a very watchful guard at midnight. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot reconstruct every campaign clearly. We cannot know how often threats were exaggerated, how often fear was politically useful, or how each household interpreted the shifting balance of power. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. But the documented parts already give you enough to feel the old unease. City-state rivalry was real. Borders mattered. Violence mattered. Public confidence mattered too precisely because it could fail. There is even a dry little joke tucked into all this if you are willing to take it. Human beings invent cities to create order, then spend centuries building walls around those cities because other human beings have invented nearby cities with the same plan. It is a remarkably consistent species habit. You could almost admire the symmetry if it were not so exhausting. The torchlight above the gate flickers again as you glance back. The guards remain where they are, silhouettes against brick and dark sky. The wall looks sturdy, and perhaps tonight it is enough. But the larger feeling remains with you. Ancient records of conflict do not need to forecast your era's geopolitics in detail to feel current. They only need to show that 5,000 years ago, people were already living with the suspicion that stability was conditional, that borders were arguments waiting for a dry season, and that public order depended on stories of protection told just loudly enough to keep everyone moving tomorrow. And so you continue through the city where the night has deepened and the sounds have thinned, yet the unease does not vanish. It settles into the stones, the ledges, the guarded entrances, the measured grain, the ruler's boasts, the labourer's silence. War is not always present in action, but it is often present in preparation. That may be the oldest echo of all. Civilizations do not simply fear collapse after it happens. They live beside the possibility long before building walls in brick, and words and hoping both will hold. The guarded wall and its torchlight fall behind you, but the feeling of conditional order does not. It lingers as you move through the deeper hours of the night when the city's public noises have faded and the inward noises begin. Sandals no longer scuff as often in the lanes. Doors are shut. Lamps burn lower. A dog turns in its sleep. Somewhere water drips steadily into a jar with the maddening precision of a timekeeper who enjoys the job too much. Above it all, the sky hangs wide and dark, and under that sky, the old stories of God still breathe through the city's silence. Most historians agree that Sumerian myths and hymns present divine beings in ways that are powerful, unpredictable, jealous, nurturing, furious, and strangely intimate. One interpretation is that these gods feel uncannily human because the stories may be expressing emotional truths in divine form rather than offering simple reports about supernatural events. You pass near a temple wall, its surface pale under moonlight, and the stillness around it feels charged rather than empty. This is not the stillness of absence, it is the stillness of attention, as though the city itself is listening for something. What's broadly accepted is that religion permeated Mesopotamian life at every level, from kingship and public ritual to household concerns and personal petitions. The evidence we do have points to a world in which the gods were not remote philosophical abstractions. They were entangled with weather, fertility, power, justice, illness, and fate. A careful reading might suggest that divine narratives in Sumer tell you as much about human feeling as they do about sacred hierarchy. That does not make the myths fake in any simple sense. Let me rephrase that more carefully. To say that divine stories express human emotion is not to reduce them to mere metaphor. Ancient people likely experienced the gods as real presences, serious powers and necessary realities. That's a possibility, not a certainty from the outside, because we cannot climb fully inside their minds. But the literary texture of the myths still matters. When a god rages, withholds favour, shows jealousy, demands honour or reverses fortune, the story often feels emotionally legible in a very human way. The heavens sound suspiciously like a family argument with larger consequences. Most historians agree that Sumerian mythology includes powerful narratives about Inanna, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Utu, and other deities whose actions shape the cosmos and the social world. Some of these myths are fragmentary. Some survive in later copies. Some remain debated in translation and interpretation. Historians still argue whether particular myths should be read mainly as ritual texts, political symbolism, theological speculation, literary entertainment, or some shifting combination of all four. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of their quiet power. The myths do not sit still, because they were never doing only one job. You stop in a narrow open space where the moonlight falls cleanly across the ground. Somewhere beyond the wall of a nearby house, someone murmurs in sleep. Somewhere else, perhaps in a temple precinct, a final ember is being banked for the night. In that half-silent atmosphere, the gods begin to feel less like distant rulers of the sky, and more like magnified versions of the emotional weather people already know. Love, desire, rivalry, wounded pride, generosity, destruction, favour, abandonment. One interpretation is that this is why the myths still feel so current. They do not only explain nature, they dramatise inner life. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the gods in these old tablets are not predicting modern moods, but revealing that ancient people already understood how unstable human experience feels from the inside? A sudden reversal in fortune can seem divine. A harvest failure can feel personal. Political chaos can look like cosmic displeasure. A careful reading might suggest that myths gave societies a language big enough to hold emotions too large for daily speech. Anger becomes a storm god. Desire becomes a goddess descending into danger. Uncertainty becomes a court of powers whose motives are never fully clear. That emotional clarity may be one reason later readers have so often tried to literalize everything. A fringe idea proposes that the Sumerian gods were not symbolic, spiritual, or mythic beings at all, but flesh and blood advanced visitors remembered as deities by simpler humans. This theory isn't widely accepted, though it remains popular, because it offers a neat mechanical explanation for stories that are more psychologically and culturally complex than that. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something more subtle and more compelling remains. The real mystery may not be whether gods were astronauts. It may be why divine stories keep sounding like magnified versions of human fear, longing and power. Most historians agree that myths in the ancient Near East often linked divine behaviour with natural forces, social order and political legitimacy. What's broadly accepted is that religion and public life were deeply intertwined. But one interpretation is that myths also helped individuals make sense of emotional instability. If the gods themselves could be unpredictable, then unpredictability was not meaningless. If divine favour could shift, then your own reversals might fit within a story larger than personal failure. If the heavens argued, perhaps your household arguments were not signs that the universe had broken completely, only that it had included you in its usual style of operations. There is a sleepy little joke in that, though the priests might not appreciate it, human beings spent centuries telling stories about omnipotent beings, and somehow those beings still manage to sound like they need a long walk and a better communication skills. The divine realm in many myths is majestic, but not exactly low drama. Enormous power does not appear to have cured emotional complexity. In that sense, the gods are either profoundly symbolic or disappointingly relatable. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot always determine how a given listener in ancient Sumer heard these stories. Did they hear theology, warning, comfort, explanation, entertainment, or all of them at once? We cannot always separate official cult meaning from private emotional reception. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Yet even the documented parts reveal a world where myth was not detached from life. It entered ritual politics, grief, weather, kingship, illness, desire, and hope. The gods were not tucked safely into one corner of existence. They were woven through the whole cloth. That woven quality is what makes the old stories feel so close tonight. You do not need to believe exactly what ancient people believed in order to recognize the patterns. People still personify luck. They still speak of fate as moody. They still imagine history turning because of forces too large to negotiate with directly. They still tell stories in which power behaves like emotion given cosmic scale. A more cautious explanation could be that this is less a direct survival of Sumerian thought and more a recurring feature of human imagination. That may be true, but it still raises the possibility that myths endure because they tell emotional truths without requiring literal certainty. And perhaps that is why the temple wall beside you feels less like a barrier than a membrane. On one side, ordinary life, wages, illness, labour, arguments, gates. On the other side, not a separate universe, but the same struggles enlarged into sacred drama. Most historians agree that Sumerian myth helped communities articulate order and relation to divine power. One interpretation is that the myths continue to resonate because they also give shape to feelings that remain stubbornly recognizable. Jealousy, need, fear of abandonment, hope for favour, the wish that someone stronger than you is paying attention, the fear that they are and that they are in a mood. As you walk on, the moonlight shifts across the brick and the city settles further into sleep, but the old stories do not sleep. They move quietly beneath everything. Not as proven messages about the modern world, not as secret codes finally cracked, but as reminders that ancient people were already using divine language to speak about the unstable inner weather of being human. The tablets do not need to describe your exact century to feel alive. They only need to show that 5,000 years ago, people were already looking at the chaos of feeling power loss and desire, and giving it names large enough to echo across the sky. The gods recede only slightly as the night deepens, because once a civilization has given cosmic names to its fears and desires, those names tend to linger in the air long after the formal prayers are done. You keep walking through the sleeping city, and now the streets feel wider than they did before, emptier in a way that makes every sound stand out. A sandal scraping far off, a jar being set down, wind brushing reeds on a rooftop, the occasional bark of a dog who is either defending the neighbourhood or simply enjoys overreacting. Above you the sky is clear, and the stars look as if they have been placed with unreasonable confidence. In that hush, the question begins to change. Not what the tablets say about grain power, floods, labour or gods, but what later people want them to say about endings. Most historians agree that no Sumerian record gives a simple script for our present age. One interpretation is that modern readers keep returning to these tablets because ancient warnings feel more meaningful when they seem to mirror our own unease and the cinematic? What if mood arrives when you wonder whether every generation secretly expects to be the last one that still remembers how the world worked? You pause in an open stretch near a temple wall where moonlight lies across the ground like pale cloth. The city is almost fully still now. It feels less like a machine and more like a body at rest, breathing quietly under mud brick and starlight. And perhaps that is exactly when end times thoughts appear most easily. Not always in panic, not with thunder and drama, but with the softer suspicion that things are becoming strained. That order is fraying. That the old stories may have seen this mood coming. A careful reading might suggest that this is not really about evidence first. It is about emotional fit. Ancient records become magnets for modern dread, because they come from so far away that people imagine they must have been looking at history from above rather than living inside their own ordinary problems. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian literature contain laments over destroyed cities, reflections on instability, flood traditions, shifting divine favour, and repeated reminders that power and prosperity are fragile. The evidence we do have points to a world deeply aware that things fall apart. Cities decline, rulers fail, crops suffer, temples are damaged, borders move. A more cautious explanation could be that these texts do not predict modern collapse, so much as preserve a long cultural memory of instability. That is not as flashy as prophecy, but it is far more grounded. Civilizations do not need to foresee your headlines to know that order is temporary. Historians still argue whether modern readers impose too much coherence on Mesopotamian materials when they assemble flood stories, omens, royal inscriptions, and laments into one sweeping theory of recurring civilizational resets. There is no full consensus, and that matters a great deal. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It would be misleading to say the tablets clearly teach that humanity rises and falls in neat cycles every few thousand years according to a single ancient plan. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and in many cases it is a stretch. But it raises the possibility that people across time notice recurring patterns of boom strain, overreach, and loss, then tell stories big enough to hold those patterns in memory. That may be where the modern fascination begins, not in solid proof, but in a recognisably human instinct. You look at an old text describing chaos, divine displeasure, flood or ruined walls, and you feel the slightest chill of recognition, not because the tablet named your century directly, but because it named the atmosphere of decline, the sense that too many systems are under stress at once, the impression that public confidence is louder than private belief, the suspicion that prosperity rests on arrangements more fragile than they seem. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the oldest warnings are really mirrors, and what you see in them depends on what your own age is afraid of losing? A fringe idea proposes that certain Sumerian records preserve literal knowledge of repeated global resets, perhaps triggered by cosmic cycles, divine interventions, lost technologies, or forgotten catastrophes that periodically erase high civilization and force humanity to begin again. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has enormous appeal because it flatters two very strong desires at once. The first is the desire to believe that history has a hidden pattern. The second is the desire to believe that your moment matters so much, it must already have been written into the deep past. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, something more subtle comes into view. The enduring power of these texts may lie less in prediction than in rhythm. Societies do rise strain, adapt, splinter and transform, not always cleanly, not always universally, but often enough that memory begins to sound cyclical. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilizations changed dramatically over time, rather than simply vanishing in one neat apocalyptic event. Sumerian cities rose and fell, political centres shifted, languages changed in prominence, cultural traditions were copied, adapted and reworked by later peoples. What's broadly accepted is not a single reset, but a long sequence of continuity and disruption braided together. One interpretation is that this may be even more unsettling than a dramatic ending. The world does not always end all at once. Sometimes it becomes something else slowly, while people living through the change continue buying grain, repairing walls, filing complaints, watching the sky, and telling themselves the real rupture has not happened yet. There is a dry little joke hidden there, if you can bear one at this hour. Human beings love apocalypse because it is tidy. One final trumpet, one enormous wave, one cosmic memo. Real history is usually much ruder. It changes the tax system, lowers the crop yield, damages a canal, weakens a ruler, moves a trade route, and leaves everybody arguing for 2 centuries about whether the golden age is recoverable. Not exactly blockbuster material, but deeply authentic. You keep walking, and the city seems almost transparent now, as if all the earlier themes are visible at once through the sleeping streets. Grain and ledgers, labour and hierarchy, flood and canal, illness and ritual, walls and anxious rulers, gods and emotional weather. They all gather here, and suddenly you can see why later readers reach for end times language. Ancient Mesopotamia offers not a single prophecy of now, but a whole ecology of fragility. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot prove that a tablet meant our present. We cannot establish that one lament, one omen, one flood, memory, or one royal warning was secretly aimed at the 21st century. But the tablets remain suggestive because they preserve something older than prediction. The habit of sensing strain before collapse has a name. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented parts already show enough to justify caution. Ancient societies understood that prosperity was conditional. They knew that environmental pressure, political rivalry, social inequality, divine uncertainty and public fear could gather into something larger than any one problem. A careful reading might suggest that modern audiences hear end times in these materials because the pattern is emotionally legible, not inevitable, not proven, not encoded as a secret countdown, but legible. When enough systems groan at once, people begin reaching backward for old language. And old language is powerful because it feels tested. If a text has survived millennia, it seems to carry authority even before it is translated. Clay looks trustworthy. Ancientness itself becomes part of the argument. A popular rumour claims that the oldest records must contain truths modern institutions want hidden, and that rumour will probably outlive all of us because it is such a satisfying story. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because mistrust likes old objects. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here, much of the stronger apocalyptic reading is indeed thin. Still, even with all the mist cleared away, the solid ground remains haunting enough. The ancients did not need to predict your exact future to understand the emotional shape of societies under pressure. By now the stars are beginning to tilt westward, and the first hint of later night, almost morning, touches the edges of the sky. The city sleeps, but not completely. Somewhere a worker rises early. Somewhere a priest turns in his blankets. Somewhere a guard shifts his weight by the gate. Life continues, which may be the most important thing of all. Ancient records do not give you a clean ending script. They do something quieter. They remind you that every civilization believes itself durable until it begins to feel otherwise, and that long before the end, if there is an end, people start searching the old stories for confirmation that someone somewhere once felt this too. The sky is beginning to pale now, though only slightly, and the city around you feels suspended in that fragile hour when night has not quite surrendered and morning has not quite claimed its rights. The stars still hang above the roofs, but they have softened. The torches at the gate burn lower. The coolness in the brick feels more noticeable against your skin. Somewhere nearby a jar is lifted, a door bolt drawn back, a sleeper turned gently towards awaking. After all the tablets, the fields, the complaints, the labour lines, the flood memories, the healer's room, the guarded wall and the uneasy sky, what remains is not a single revelation but a quieter accumulation. Most historians agree that Sumerian writing endures because it captured both ordinary administration and extraordinary imagination in material tough enough to survive. One interpretation is that these records feel alive now because they preserve not one hidden truth but many familiar human patterns pressed into clay before history had fully learned its own name. You stand once more with a tablet in mind, if not in hand. Not a magical object. Not a perfect mirror. Not a prophecy machine humming beneath museum glass. Just a small rectangle of earth, once wet, then marked, then dried by sun and time into memory. What's broadly accepted is that these tablets preserve the earliest written traces of urban administration, religion, literature and social organisation on a remarkable scale. Archaeology suggests that their survival is partly an accident of material and environment, but one interpretation is that their deeper survival comes from recognition. You read a record of grain and hear budgeting stress. You read a royal boast and hear political theatre. You read a flood tradition and hear environmental fear. You read a lament and hear loneliness echoing through crowded streets. You read an omen and hear a civilization trying to forecast uncertainty before it arrives fully dressed. Historians still argue whether modern readers are too quick to see themselves in the ancient world, and that is a fair caution. The differences are real. Sumer was not a rehearsal for modern life in any simple sense. It's God's institutions, class structures, technologies and assumptions about the body, the state and the sacred were profoundly different from yours. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It would be misleading to say the tablets describe events happening now in a literal and precise way, as though a scribe 5,000 years ago had somehow drafted a tidy memo about your exact century. That's a possibility only in the loosest poetic sense, not a certainty in the historical one. But if we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, a gentler truth appears. The records feel current because they describe conditions that human beings keep recreating whenever they gather in large numbers and try to stay organised for long enough. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real wonder is not prediction, but continuity? Not that ancient people foresaw your machines, your borders, your charts, your headlines, or your private anxieties, word for word, but that they already knew the structure of many of those anxieties. They knew the pressure of limited resources, the fatigue of labour systems, the fragility of public order, the difficulty of interpreting signs, the ache of illness, the loneliness hidden inside the crowd, the temptation to turn leaders into saviours, the temptation to turn the sky into reassurance, the fear that the world one depends on may be less stable than it appears. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia wrestled with all of these in its own forms. One interpretation is that what survives in clay is not a coded message to us, but an old map of recurring human weather. A fringe idea proposes that the tablets preserve an intentional message across time, a buried design, a set of warnings too exact to be accidental. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it continues because ancient objects invite secret meanings, the way dark windows invite reflections. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, perhaps the safer insight is also the more moving one. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot prove that a particular line was meant for this age. We cannot confirm a single hidden script running beneath all the texts. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination, and yet imagination is not the enemy here. It is the soft bridge that that lets you feel for a moment how near another mind can seem across 5,000 years. The city begins to stir more noticeably now. A cartwheel groans. Water splashes into a basin. Somewhere, someone coughs, clears a throat, and starts the day without asking anyone's permission. The first birds pick at the edges of the silence, and as the light slowly widens over the roofs, you understand something simple and almost tender. The tablets remained because people kept pressing life into them. Not only glory but routine, not only mystery but management, not only gods but grain. Civilization saved its receipts, and in doing so saved pieces of its soul. There is a small joke in that, though it arrives gently. Humanity's oldest great written legacy includes some of its loftiest hymns and some of its earliest bookkeeping, which is a wonderfully honest combination. Even at the dawn of recorded history, people were already balancing awe and administration heaven, and inventory cosmic wonder, and the deeply suspicious question of where the barley went. That may be one of the most trustworthy signs that the ancient world was inhabited by real people. And so the night's journey folds inward. You have not uncovered a final answer. You have not solved the tablets into one neat formula. What's broadly accepted is more modest and in some ways more beautiful. The evidence we do have points to a civilization both distant and recognizable, one that built cities, counted labour, revered gods, feared floods, argued over goods, watched the sky, tended, the sick guarded the walls, and wondered how long order could last. One interpretation is that this is why the records continue to pull at modern minds. They remind you that history is not a straight march into novelty. Much of it is recurrence with different furniture. Now the light grows softer and wider still, and the hard edges of night begin to loosen. The walls of the city are no longer silhouettes, but warm surfaces waiting for day. The canals reflect a faint silver blue. The roofs take on shape and texture. The stars fade without complaint. Somewhere a scribe may soon sit down with fresh clay, and somewhere a worker will shoulder a basket, and somewhere a ruler will prepare to sound more confident than he feels. Life resumes as it always does, and perhaps that is the final comfort. Ancient people did not wake each morning inside a grand mystery. They woke inside a day. Another day of work, devotion, uncertainty, heat, noise, and hope. The tablets survived because days survived long enough to be marked. So let the city soften now. Let the torchlight disappear into morning. Let the reed beds murmur at the edge of the hearing. Let the clay cool in your mind. You do not need to force the old records to become prophecies in order to feel their closeness. It is enough that they were made by hands, by tired hands, and careful hands, and hopeful hands, by people who did not know you and could not imagine your world, yet still left behind shapes of worry and wonder that you can recognize in the dark. That may be the most human thing of all. And now, as the first true morning gathers itself over Sumer, the pace can slow. The roofs grow pale. The canals hold the sky in long, quiet bands. The city, which seemed at times so loud, so anxious, so crowded with systems and fears, begins to blur gently at the edges, not vanishing, only settling into distance. You can let the kings go now, and the scribes and the watchers on the roofs. You can let the grain accounts rest in their baskets. You can let the healers lower their hands, the guards ease their stance, the labourers sleep for one moment longer before the day claims them. Nothing here asks you to solve it before you drift off. Nothing here demands certainty. The old clay has already done enough by simply enduring. So breathe a little more slowly. Let the questions grow softer. Let the debated theories become mist beyond the solid ground. Let the documented things remain steady and plain, like brick warming under a new sun. Somewhere in that distance, reeds still whisper by the canal banks, and somewhere a stylus touches wet clay with a small dry sound, marking another ordinary moment in a world that once felt permanent and now survives only in fragments. Yet fragments can be kind. Fragments can remind you that no age is entirely alone in its worries, and no night is entirely empty if memory is still awake within it. The city recedes, the sky brightens, the last stars are gone, and in their place comes that simplest of endings, the one ancient people knew as well as you do now. Morning arrives quietly, whether or not anyone has finished understanding the world.